The first thing I noticed when I walked into that Tuesday night HOA board meeting was the smell of burnt coffee and something else, fear, maybe, or just the stale air of people who'd rather be anywhere else. I'm Ethan Granger, and I'd moved into Meadowbrook Estates in Phoenix, Arizona 6 months ago, thinking I'd finally found a quiet place to settle down after my divorce. What I didn't count on was Barbara Hutchins, the HOA president, making my life a living hell over a garden gnome I'd placed by my front door. But tonight wasn't about my gnome. Tonight was supposed to be routine. The monthly board meeting in the community center, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, folding chairs squeaking against linoleum. There were maybe 30 homeowners scattered around the room, most looking at their phones, waiting for this to be over so they could get back to their lives. Barbara sat at the front table with the other board members, Richard Palmer, the vice president who always nodded along with whatever Barbara said, and Sandra Yates, the treasurer who seemed perpetually exhausted. I sat in the back row, arms crossed, still bitter about the $50 fine I'd received last week for my trash cans being visible from the street for more than 2 hours after collection. Never mind that I'd been at work. Never mind that the HOA covenant said 4 hours, not 2. Barbara had her own interpretation of the rules, and that was what mattered in Meadowbrook Estates. The meeting droned on. Barbara's voice had that particular quality that made you want to jab pencils in your ears, nasal, condescending, punctuated with dramatic pauses she clearly thought made her sound important. We were 20 minutes into a discussion about whether the community pool chairs should be navy blue or royal blue when the door at the back of the room opened. A man walked in carrying a leather briefcase, and I recognized him immediately. Marcus Webb, the land surveyor who'd been hired 3 months ago to settle a dispute about the community park boundaries. The dispute had started when Barbara decided the HOA wanted to expand the dog park into what several homeowners claimed was actually county land. Those homeowners had pooled money to hire Marcus independently, but somehow Barbara had convinced the board to hire him officially, using our HOA fees, claiming it would resolve everything. Marcus looked nervous, his tie was loose, and there were sweat stains under his arms despite the air conditioning. He stood by the door for a moment, and Barbara stopped mid-sentence about paint swatches. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice sharp, "you're late. We scheduled you for 7:30, and it's now 7:53. "I apologize," Marcus said. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. "I needed to verify some information before I came." "Well, you're here now, please. Enlighten us about the boundary situation so we can move forward with the dog park expansion." Barbara gestured to the front of the room like a queen granting an audience. Marcus walked down the center aisle, and I noticed other homeowners sitting up straighter. The Johnsons, who lived on the property adjacent to the disputed land, looked particularly interested. Tom Johnson had been vocal about his opposition to Barbara's plan, which had earned him 3 separate fines in the past month for various alleged violations. Marcus reached the front table and set his briefcase down. He opened it and pulled out a thick folder stuffed with documents, maps, and what looked like photographs. His hands were shaking now, noticeably. "Mrs. Hutchins, board members, homeowners," he began, looking around the room. "I've completed my survey of the disputed area, and I've also taken the liberty of examining the original plat maps for Meadowbrook Estates, the county records, and the documentation filed when this HOA was established in 1998. Yes, Barbara said, waving her hand dismissively. "And you found that the land is part of the HOA property, correct? So we can proceed with." "No," Marcus interrupted. The single word seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised Barbara. "No, that's not what I found." The room went quieter. Barbara's face tightened. "Excuse me?" Marcus pulled out several large sheet survey maps, I guessed, and spread them on the table. "The land in question, approximately 2 acres adjacent to the current dog park, is indeed county land. It was never part of the Meadowbrook Estates development. However, in the course of my research, I discovered something else." He was really sweating now. I leaned forward in my chair. "What I discovered is that Meadowbrook Estates, as it currently exists, has been collecting HOA fees based on assessments that include this county land. For the past 15 years, homeowners have been paying fees calculated as if the community contained this additional 2 acres, plus another 3-acre parcel on the eastern border that is also not part of the actual development. That's absurd, Barbara snapped. Our property lines are clearly established. They are now, Marcus said, but they weren't always. The original developer, Sunshine Properties, LLC, included these parcels in the marketing materials and the HOA documents, even though they never actually owned them. When the development was sold and the HOA took over management, these phantom parcels remained in the documentation. I have the deed records here. He tapped the folder. Richard Palmer, the vice president, cleared his throat. So you're saying we've been charging fees based on incorrect square footage? Not just incorrect, Marcus said. I'm saying the HOA has collected approximately $785,000 in excess fees over 15 years based on land that does exist as part of this community. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, angry, confused, demanding. Barbara hammered her gavel, but nobody paid attention. I sat back, trying to process. $785,000. That was nearly $800,000 collected from homeowners for property the HOA didn't own. Furthermore, Marcus continued, his voice rising above the chaos, I found that 3 years ago, when Mrs. Hutchins became president, she commissioned a private survey. That survey clearly identified this discrepancy. And that's when he dropped it. Marcus pulled out a bound report from his briefcase, maybe 40 pages thick, and held it up. This is the report from that survey dated October 2023, prepared by Southwest Land Surveys. It was delivered to Mrs. Hutchins personally. I obtained it through a public records request from the county, as Southwest Land Surveys filed certain information with the county as part of their standard practice. He held it for a moment, and everyone stared. Then his hands shook, and the report slipped from his grip. It hit the table with a heavy thud, then slid off and crashed to the floor, papers spilling everywhere. The room went completely silent. Barbara Hutchins' face had gone from red to white. Sandra Yates, the treasurer, stood up slowly. Barbara, she said, you commissioned a private survey? That's not in any of the board minutes. Barbara started, but Marcus wasn't finished. The survey cost $11,000, Marcus said, bending to gather the spilled papers. It was paid from HOA funds, but it was recorded in the budget as landscaping consultation. And after Mrs. Hutchins received this report, which clearly showed the boundary problems and the ex-ease feces, she buried it. She continued collecting fees at the inflated rate and began pushing for the dog park expansion, which would have essentially claimed county land through adverse possession if left unchallenged long enough. Tom Johnson was on his feet. You knew? Barbara, you knew we were being overcharged and you kept collecting? This is slander, Barbara shouted. Mr. Webb is clearly in league with the malcontents who want to undermine this board. I'll be filing a lawsuit against you personally. File whatever you want, Marcus said quietly. He'd picked up all the papers and reassembled them on the table. I have copies of everything. The original survey, the deed records, the county plat maps, the HOA budget documents showing the landscaping consultation payment, and email correspondence between you and Southwest Land Surveys, where you specifically instructed them not to share their findings with the board or the homeowners. How did you get my emails? Barbara's voice was shrill now. I didn't, Marcus said. Southwest Land Surveys provided them voluntarily when I explained what I'd found. They were uncomfortable with being part of this situation. They kept copies for their own protection. Sandra Yates sat down heavily. Oh my God, Barbara, what did you do? The meeting dissolved into chaos. Homeowners were shouting questions. Barbara was shouting back, her face purple, veins standing out on her neck. Richard Palmer sat frozen, looking like he wanted to disappear into his chair. I pulled out my phone and started recording. So did half a dozen other people. A woman I recognized as Helen Ortega, who lived 3 houses down from me, stood up. I'm calling the police. This is fraud. Don't be ridiculous, Barbara said. This is a civil matter, a misunderstanding about property boundaries and bookkeeping. You stole almost $800,000 from us, Tom Johnson said. His voice was shaking with rage. That's criminal. I didn't steal anything. The fees were calculated based on the best information available. For 15 years maybe, Marcus Webb said, but not for the past 3 years. Not since you got that survey and buried it. I watched Sandra Yates pull out her phone and start scrolling through something, the HOA financial records, maybe. Her face got paler and paler. Barbara, I need to see the complete budget documentation, all of it. The bank statements, the receipts, everything. You're the treasurer, Barbara shot back. You have access to everything, not to your private email, not to surveys you commissioned without board approval. Sandra's voice was getting stronger, and looking at these numbers now, there are other discrepancies. Line items that don't make sense. Barbara, I've been managing this community for 3 years, keeping property values up, maintaining standards. Barbara grabbed her purse. I don't have to sit here and be accused by a corrupt surveyor and ungrateful homeowners who don't appreciate everything I do. She started toward the door, but Tom Johnson moved to block her path. You're not leaving. Not until we figure this out. Get out of my way, or I'll add another violation to your account. My account? Tom laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. I'm guessing none of our accounts are worth anything if you've been cooking the books. Richard Palmer finally found his voice. Barbara, please. Let's all calm down and go through this systematically. I'm sure there's an explanation. The explanation is fraud, Helen Ortega said. She had her phone to her ear. Yes, I need to report a crime. Meadowbrook Estates HOA in Phoenix. Yes. Fraud. Embezzlement, possibly. We need an officer here. Barbara's eyes went wild. You people are insane. I'm leaving and I'm contacting our attorney. This meeting is adjourned. She shoved past Tom Johnson and practically ran for the door. Richard Palmer called after her, but she was gone, the door slamming behind her. The room broke into frantic conversation. Marcus Webb stood at the front, still holding his folder, looking exhausted. I got up and walked to the front. Mr. Webb, you have copies of all this? He nodded. Multiple copies. And I've already filed my findings with the county recorder's office. This is public record now. Good man, I said. Sandra Yates was on her phone now, too. Yes, I need to speak to someone about freezing an account. I'm the treasurer of an HOA, and we've just discovered possible fraud by our president. No, I'm not joking. 2 Phoenix PD officers arrived about 15 minutes later. By then, the meeting room was packed. Word had spread somehow. Texts, phone calls, and homeowners who hadn't been at the meeting were showing up. The officers, a young guy named Patterson and an older woman named Detective Morales, listened to Marcus Webb's explanation, examined the documents, and took statements from about a dozen people. This is complicated, Detective Morales said finally. We're talking about HOA regulations, property law, possibly fraud, possibly embezzlement. We'll need to bring in white-collar crime specialists. What do we do in the meantime? Sandra Yates asked. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. I have access to the bank accounts. Should I freeze them? Don't touch anything, Detective Morales said. You could compromise evidence. We'll get a warrant and work with the bank directly. In the meantime, I want copies of everything: budget documents, bylaws, anything related to fee assessment and collection. I have most of it, Sandra said, but Barbara kept some things separate on her personal computer. She said it was more efficient. Detective Morales exchanged a look with Officer Patterson. Of course she did. What's her address? Tom Johnson provided it. Barbara lived in the largest house in the development, a sprawling place with a 3-car garage and a yard that somehow never violated any HOA rules. The detectives left with promises to follow up. The rest of us stayed in the community center, too wired to go home. Marcus Webb ended up at the center of a group, explaining the survey process, showing people the maps and deed records. I studied them over shoulders. The phantom parcels were clear once you knew what to look for. Areas included in HOA maps that had different parcel numbers on county records, land that had never been part of the original development sale. How did this happen in the first place? Someone asked. Marcus shrugged. Developers sometimes get sloppy. Sunshine Properties LLC probably intended to buy that county land but never closed the deal. Or they included it speculatively, thinking they'd acquire it later. But they went bankrupt in 2009 during the recession, and all their assets were liquidated. The HOA took over, and whoever was managing it then just copied the existing documentation without verifying it. But Barbara knew, Helen Ortega said. For 3 years she knew, and kept collecting, I added. Which raises the question, where did the money go? Sandra Yates overheard. The operating account has approximately $240,000 in it. We have a reserve fund that's supposed to have another $300,000, but I'd need to verify that. If we collected $785,000 in excess fees, even accounting for normal expenses, there should be more, I finished. Sandra nodded slowly. There should be a lot more. We found out over the next week as the investigation unfolded. Barbara Hutchins had been skimming. The excess fees were just the beginning. She'd been approving fake vendor invoices, paying herself consultation fees for work that was never done, and transferring money to shell companies she'd set up. The total amount she'd stolen was over $1.2 million when you factored in everything. The dog park expansion plan was even more cynical than it first appeared. Barbara had planned to claim the county land through adverse possession if the HOA used it openly and without challenge for long enough, they could potentially claim ownership. Then she'd planned to broker a deal to sell that land to a commercial developer who wanted to build a strip mall. Her cut would have been $250,000. I learned all this because I ended up on the emergency board that was appointed after Barbara was arrested. The original board had to resign. Richard Palmer and Sandra Yates both stepped down, claiming they should have known what was happening. Sandra was genuinely distraught. Richard just looked relieved to escape. The arrest happened on a Wednesday, 3 days after the meeting. I was watering my front yard when police cars rolled into Barbara's driveway. Lots of neighbors came out to watch as Barbara was let out in handcuffs, still shouting about persecution and incompetent homeowners who didn't understand proper management. She spent the night in jail before her lawyer posted bail. The interim board consisted of me, Tom Johnson, Helen Ortega, a retired accountant named Peter Franklin, and a lawyer named Diana Reed, who'd recently moved to Meadowbrook Estates from California. Our first task was to figure out exactly how bad the damage was. Peter Franklin spent 2 weeks going through the books with a forensic accountant hired by our insurance company. The news wasn't good. Barbara had been stealing for the entire 3 years she'd been president, starting small and getting bolder. The operating account and reserve fund were both depleted. We had enough to cover basic expenses for maybe 2 months. We're essentially bankrupt, Peter announced at an emergency homeowners meeting. The insurance will cover some of the losses, but we'll need a special assessment to rebuild the reserves and cover operating costs until the insurance claim is processed. The room erupted in groans and angry questions. Nobody wanted to pay more money. Not after finding out we'd been overcharged for 15 years. Diana Reed, our lawyer board member, held up her hands. I know this is terrible, but here's the good news. We're working with the county to restructure our HOA boundaries and fees based on the correct property lines. Going forward, your monthly fees will actually decrease by about 30%. And we're pursuing both criminal and civil cases against Barbara Hutchins. Any money recovered will go back to the homeowners. What are the chances we recover anything? Someone asked. Diana grimaced. Honestly, not great. Barbara spent most of what she stole. Luxury vacations, a boat she kept in California, designer clothes. She remortgaged her house to cover some of her spending when she ran through the HOA money. Her assets will be seized and sold, but it'll probably amount to maybe $300,000 total. Split among all homeowners, that's not much per household. What about jail time? Tom Johnson asked. Please tell me she's going to jail. The DA is charging her with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and theft, Diana said. Given the amount involved and the duration, she's looking at significant prison time if convicted. Her lawyer is already floating plea deal ideas. The special assessment ended up being $2,000 per household, payable over 6 months. It hurt, but most people paid it because we didn't have a choice. A few households couldn't afford it, and the board worked out payment plans. We all understood now that we were in this together. Barbara had stolen from everyone, and we all had to chip in to fix the damage she'd caused. Meanwhile, the criminal case moved forward. I attended most of the hearings, partly out of curiosity and partly because I felt invested. This woman had fined me for a garden gnome, threatened me over trash cans, and stolen my money along with everyone else's. I wanted to see justice done. Barbara's lawyer, a slick guy named Ronald Tanner, tried every trick he could think of. He argued the charges should be dismissed because HOA finances were inherently complicated and his client had made honest mistakes. He claimed Barbara had psychological issues that explained her behavior. He suggested she was being scapegoated for systemic problems in how HOAs were regulated in Arizona. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Janet Morris, demolished every argument. She presented the buried survey as clear evidence that Barbara knew exactly what she was doing. She brought in Southwest Land Survey's representatives to testify about Barbara's instructions to hide their findings. She showed the fake invoices, the shell companies, the luxury purchases. She traced money from the HOA accounts to Barbara's personal accounts and then to boat dealers, vacation resorts, and high-end boutiques. The preliminary hearing was devastating for Barbara's defense. The judge found sufficient evidence for trial on all counts and denied bail. Barbara spent the next 4 months in county jail awaiting trial, her lawyer filing increasingly desperate motions that all got denied. Back at Meadowbrook Estates, we were rebuilding. The interim board worked to establish better financial controls, dual signatures on all checks, monthly audits, complete transparency with quarterly meetings to review finances. We hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, taking that burden off volunteer board members. We also completely rewrote the HOA covenants. The old ones were 40 pages of petty restrictions and vague language that people like Barbara could interpret however they wanted. The new ones were 10 pages, focused on genuinely important issues like property maintenance and noise, and eliminated most of the nitpicky rules that had made people's lives miserable. My garden gnome was officially approved, as were trash cans being visible for up to 8 hours after collection and reasonable decorations and landscaping choices. We weren't eliminating standards, but we were making them sensible. The transformation in the community was remarkable. People actually started talking to each other, organizing barbecues and block parties. We'd been united by adversity, and it stuck. Tom Johnson became a good friend. Helen Ortega started a community garden on a piece of common land, and nobody complained about whether the tomatoes were the approved color. Barbara's trial finally started in late September, 6 months after that chaotic board meeting. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I attended when I could get time off work. The courtroom was packed with Meadowbrook Estates residents for the first few days, though the crowd thinned as the testimony got technical. Ronald Tanner tried to paint Barbara as a devoted community servant who'd gotten in over her head. He brought in character witnesses who talked about her volunteer work and her dedication to maintaining property values. He tried to suggest that the financial irregularities were mistakes, not crimes. Janet Morris methodically destroyed this narrative. She called Marcus Webb to explain the buried survey and what it proved about Barbara's knowledge and intent. She called Peter Franklin to walk through the forensic accounting. She called homeowners who testified about Barbara's vindictive use of fines and her threats against anyone who questioned her. Then she called witnesses who destroyed any sympathy Barbara might have had. A travel agent testified about the 15 luxury vacations Barbara had booked, totaling over $200,000. A boat dealer described the $75,000 yacht Barbara had purchased. A boutique owner talked about Barbara's shopping sprees, often spending $5,000 or $10,000 in a single visit. And how did Mrs. Hutchins pay for these purchases? Janet Morris asked. Always with checks from her personal account, the boutique owner said. But she'd joke about it. She'd say things like, "The homeowners are funding my wardrobe," or "This is what I get for dealing with neighborhood drama." I thought she was just being funny for salary. She wasn't being paid a salary for her HOA work, Janet Morris said. It was volunteer. Oh, the boutique owner looked uncomfortable. Then I guess she wasn't joking. The defense tried to recover during cross-examination, but there was no real answer to the evidence. The jury got the case on a Thursday afternoon after closing arguments. Janet Morris had been powerful, laying out the timeline of Barbara's theft, the planning that went into it, the lives disrupted by it. Barbara Hutchins didn't make mistakes, she told the jury. She made choices. She chose to bury a survey that would have exposed her scheme. She chose to keep collecting inflated fees from hardworking families. She chose to create fake companies and fake invoices. She chose to spend over $1 million of other people's money on boats and vacations and designer clothes. These weren't errors. This was calculated, systematic theft from people who trusted her, hold her accountable. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, Barbara stood to hear the verdict. I was in the courtroom 3 rows back. I could see her shoulders shaking. Guilty on all counts. Barbara collapsed, and her lawyer had to help her to her chair. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. Barbara was remanded into custody immediately, and I watched as the bailiff led her out, her hands cuffed behind her back. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The sentencing hearing was shorter. The judge, a stern woman named Carolyn Webster, listened to victim impact statements from several homeowners. Tom Johnson spoke about the stress of the special assessment and how it had drained his savings. An elderly couple talked about having to delay medical procedures because they needed money for the HOA fees. A single mother described working extra shifts to cover the costs. Then Judge Webster turned to Barbara. "Mrs. Hutchins, you were given a position of trust within your community. People elected you to represent their interests, to manage their collective resources, to maintain the quality of their neighborhood. You betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way. You stole from them, systematically and without remorse, for years. You lived lavishly while families struggled. And when you were caught, your only concern was avoiding responsibility. The law takes theft of this magnitude seriously. The law takes abuse of fiduciary duty seriously. This court takes it seriously. On the count of fraud in the first degree, I sentence you to 8 years in prison. On the counts of embezzlement, I sentence you to 6 years, to run consecutively. On the counts of theft, additional time to run concurrently. Your total sentence is 14 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections." Barbara sobbed openly. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, but there was nothing left to say. 14 years. She'd be nearly 70 when she got out, assuming she made parole. The judge wasn't finished. "Additionally, you are ordered to make full restitution to Meadowbrook Estates HOA and its members in the amount of $1,237,418. Your assets will be liquidated and distributed to the victims. You are permanently barred from serving on any homeowner association board or in any fiduciary capacity." The gavel came down, and Barbara was led away. I left the courtroom feeling oddly hollow. Justice had been done, sure. Barbara would spend the next decade or more in prison, but the money was mostly gone, and the damage to the community had been real. We'd recovered, but it had taken work and time and money that shouldn't have been necessary. The asset liquidation happened over the next 2 months. Barbara's house sold for $420,000, but after the mortgage was paid off, the HOA got $200,000. The boat brought in $45,000. Her jewelry, art, and other luxury items went for another $60,000. Total recovery was just under $310,000, split among the 197 households in Meadowbrook Estates. That came to about $1,570 per household. It didn't cover the special assessment, but it helped. Peter Franklin organized the distribution, and every household got a check by Christmas. The interim board held elections in January, 1 year after the disaster. I ran for a position, figuring I'd invested enough time that I might as well make it official. Tom Johnson ran. Helen Ortega ran. We all got elected along with Peter Franklin and a newcomer named Sarah Mitchell who worked in IT and had ideas about creating a better online system for HOA communications. Our first official act was to formally accept Mark Fark's web survey and file the corrected property boundaries with the county. The phantom parcels were removed from all HOA documentation. Our monthly fees dropped from $285 to $195, reflecting the actual property size and realistic operating costs. The second act was to establish a memorial of sorts, not to Barbara, but to the lesson learned. We created a transparency policy requiring all HOA finances to be posted online, updated monthly, with detailed explanations of every expense over $100. We instituted term limits for board members. We required annual independent audits. We called it the Meadowbrook Accountability Standards, and we encouraged other HOAs to adopt similar policies. A few local news stations did stories about our situation, and we got calls from HOA board members across Arizona asking for advice on preventing similar fraud. Life at Meadowbrook Estates settled into a new normal. The drama faded, replaced by actual community. The pool got new chairs. We went with navy blue after a simple vote. The park remained at its original size on land we actually owned. The dog park got some improvements funded by money we saved through proper management. I kept my garden gnome and added a second one. Nobody fined me. Tom Johnson painted his house a shade of beige that was technically outside the approved color palette, and we voted to expand the palette instead of making him repaint. Common sense prevailed again and again. Barbara Hutchins became a cautionary tale, someone we'd mention when discussing HOA business. Remember, Barbara became shorthand for, let's not abuse our power, or let's be transparent about this. It was a useful reminder. I ran into Marcus Webb one day at a coffee shop in Phoenix, about 18 months after the original board meeting. He was having lunch with someone, but he waved me over. "Ethan, right?" he said. "Meadowbrook Estates? That's me. How are you doing, Marcus?" "Good. Really good, actually." He gestured to his lunch companion. "This is my business partner, Lisa. We started a firm specializing in HOA consulting, proper boundary surveys, financial audits, compliance reviews. Business has been great. That disaster was the best thing that ever happened to your career," I joked. Marcus laughed. "In a weird way, yeah, but I'm glad it worked out." "I heard Meadowbrook is doing well?" "Really well. We've got actual community now. People like living there. That's good to hear. You know, I've done surveys for maybe 200 HOAs at this point, and you'd be surprised how many have similar issues. Not fraud, usually, but sloppy record keeping, boundary problems, missing documentation. Your situation was extreme, but the underlying issues are common." We talked for a few more minutes before I left them to their lunch. Walking back to my car, I reflected on how everything had changed. 2 years ago, I'd been a bitter divorced guy who just wanted to be left alone, fighting with a petty HOA president over a gnome. Now I was part of a functional community, serving on a board that actually helped people instead of harassing them. Barbara had tried to control everything and ended up losing everything we'd learned from that. Control wasn't the point. Community was. Taking care of shared spaces and shared interests without making people's lives miserable, that was the goal. The last time I thought about Barbara Hutchins was when I got an email from the Arizona Department of Corrections forwarding a message she'd sent through their system. Inmates could send limited emails to people on an approved list, and apparently she'd added several Meadowbrook residents. The email was short. "I'm sorry for what I did. I know you won't forgive me, and I don't blame you. I just wanted you to know I think about it every day. I destroyed something good because I thought I knew better than everyone else. I was wrong. I hope Meadowbrook is doing well, Barbara." I stared at the email for a long time. Part of me wanted to reply with anger, listing all the damage she'd caused. Part of me just wanted to delete it. In the end, I did neither. I forwarded it to the other board members and asked what they thought. Tom Johnson replied first, "Too little, too late." Helen Ortega was more philosophical. "She's paying for what she did. Maybe she has changed. Doesn't undo the past, though." Peter Franklin said, "Apologies are meaningless without restitution, and she can't provide that." Sarah Mitchell wrote, "I don't know her, so I don't have strong feelings, but I guess it takes something to admit you were wrong." I never replied to Barbara's email. There wasn't anything to say. She'd stolen from us, lied to us, betrayed the trust we'd placed in her. An apology didn't fix that. 14 years in prison didn't even really fix that. What fixed it was what we'd built afterward, a real community based on transparency and respect instead of control and fear. Meadowbrook Estates continued to thrive. The property values that Barbara had obsessed over actually went up, but not because of rigid rule enforcement. They went up because people wanted to live in a place where neighbors looked out for each other, where the HOA facilitated community instead of imposing tyranny. We had our challenges, of course. Disputes about noise, disagreements about common area usage, the occasional personality conflict. But we worked through them like reasonable people. We compromised. We listened. We remembered that we all had to live together, and making that pleasant was more important than winning every argument. 3 years after Marcus Webb dropped that report on the table and changed everything, I was sitting by my front door, garden gnomes proudly displayed, having a beer with Tom Johnson. We just finished a productive board meeting, actual productive, where we approved a new playground for the community park and discussed a volunteer program for yard help for elderly residents. You ever think about that night? Tom asked. The night everything exploded? Sometimes, I admitted. It was terrifying at the time, discovering we'd been robbed, that someone we'd trusted was so corrupt. But we're better off now, Tom said. I mean, it cost us money and stress, but we're genuinely better off. He was right. We were. Barbara's downfall had forced us to confront how broken our HOA was and rebuild it properly. We'd turned a nightmare into an opportunity. You know what I remember most? I said. The sound that report made when it hit the floor, that thud, and then the silence, like everyone knew in that instant that nothing would ever be the same. Tom nodded. Marcus looked like he was going to pass out, just standing there with all those papers everywhere, watching Barbara's face turn colors. We both laughed, though it wasn't really funny. Lives had been disrupted, a woman had gone to prison, families had struggled. But we'd survived, and we'd made something better from the wreckage. To Marcus Webb, Tom raised his beer, the surveyor who accidentally became a hero. To Marcus, I agreed, clinking bottles. The sun was setting over Phoenix, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Kids played in the street, their parents watching from porches. Someone a few houses down was grilling, and the smell of barbecue drifted on the evening air. This was what Meadowbrook Estates was supposed to be, not a place where people lived in fear of fines and violations, but a home where people actually wanted to be. Barbara Hutchins had wanted to control every aspect of this place, to impose her vision regardless of what anyone else wanted. She'd seen herself as the guardian of property values and community standards. Instead, she'd nearly destroyed the community through her greed and arrogance. We'd rebuilt without her, better than before. That was her legacy, though not the one she'd intended. She'd shown us how bad an HOA could be, and we'd responded by creating something good. I finished my beer and stood up. I should head inside. Board meeting notes to write up. You're very conscientious about that, Tom said. Transparency, I replied. We promised complete transparency, and that includes detailed notes posted within 24 hours. Tom nodded approvingly. Barbara would have hated that. Good, I said. That means we're doing it right inside my house. I opened my laptop and started typing up the meeting notes. New playground equipment, estimated cost $12,000, funded from reserves. Volunteer yard program, organizational meeting scheduled. Proposal to improve street lighting, research needed on costs and county regulations. Minor repair to pool filtration system, contractor already scheduled, normal stuff, boring stuff. The kind of things an HOA should be dealing with instead of fake companies and buried surveys and stolen money. I formatted the notes, added them to the website, and sent an email to all homeowners letting them know the update was posted. 3 people replied within an hour, thanking me for the transparency. It still felt good, even after 3 years of doing this. We'd earned back the trust that Barbara had destroyed, and we maintained it through consistent, honest communication. The next morning, I was leaving for work when Helen Ortega called out to me from across the street. Ethan, did you see the news? I walked over. She was holding her phone, looking upset. What news? Barbara, she's in the hospital. Apparently, she got into a fight with another inmate and got hurt pretty badly. I took the phone and read the article. Barbara had been involved in an altercation at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville. Details were limited, but she'd suffered injuries requiring hospitalization. Her condition was stable. Huh, I said, handing back the phone. I tried to feel something sympathy, maybe, or satisfaction, that her punishment continued, but I just felt empty. Barbara Hutchins was no longer part of my life or my community. What happened to her in prison was between her and the consequences of her actions. You don't seem very affected, Helen observed. Should I be? She stole from us. She's in prison. That's justice. What happens to her day to day isn't my concern. Helen nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. It just seems sad somehow. She's a human being, even if she did terrible things. She is, I agreed. And she made choices that led her to where she is. I hope she recovers from her injuries. But I'm not going to lose sleep over it. I left for work, and that was the last time I thought about Barbara for months. Life moved forward. Meadowbrook Estates continued its transformation. The new playground opened in April, and we had a community celebration with food trucks and live music. Over 200 people showed up, which was incredible for a neighborhood of less than 200 households. People brought friends from other communities, curious about the HOA that had made news for cleaning up corruption. A reporter from a Phoenix newspaper came to the celebration and did a feature story about us. From Fraud to Functional, How One HOA Reformed Itself ran in the Sunday edition with photos of the playground and interviews with several board members. The story caught on, getting shared across social media, and we got emails from HOAs across the country asking for advice. We created a toolkit, our reformed covenants, our financial transparency policies, our board election procedures, and made it available for free download from the website. Over 5,000 HOAs downloaded it in the first year. Some adapted it for their own use. A few invited us to speak at their communities or regional HOA conferences. I ended up doing a presentation at a conference in Denver, explaining our story and the changes we'd implemented. It was surreal standing in front of 300 HOA board members, talking about Barbara's theft and Marcus's survey and the community we'd built from the ashes. During the question and answer session, someone asked, "How do you prevent this from happening again? What if your current board becomes corrupt?" "You can't prevent it entirely," I admitted. "People are people, and some will always abuse power given the chance. But you can make it harder and catch it earlier. Our financial controls mean no single person can move money without oversight. Our transparency means homeowners see every expense and can question anything suspicious. Our term limits mean nobody stays in power long enough to build the kind of system Barbara created. And our community involvement means people pay attention. They come to meetings. They read the updates. An informed community is the best defense against corruption." Another person asked, "Do you ever regret getting involved? It sounds like a lot of work." "Sometimes," I said honestly, "board work is unpaid and sometimes thankless. But then I think about what Meadowbrook was like under Barbara, the fear, the petty fines, the constant stress. I think about what it is now, the block parties, the playground, kids playing in the streets. It's worth the work. Community is worth the work." The presentation got strong feedback, and I flew home feeling like maybe something good had come from the whole mess. Barbara's crime had become a teaching moment for HOAs everywhere. That was something. Years passed. My term on the board ended, and I chose not to run for re-election. New people stepped up, bringing fresh energy and ideas. I attended meetings as a regular homeowner now, offering input when asked, but mostly just appreciating the competent leadership. Meadowbrook continued to thrive. I dated someone for a while, a woman named Rachel who thought my HOA reform work was charming. It didn't work out, but we remained friends. I focused on my work, my small social circle, my quiet life in a neighborhood that had become genuinely pleasant. The 7th anniversary of Marcus Webb dropping that report passed with little fanfare. Most people in Meadowbrook had moved on. Some of the newer residents didn't even know the full story. They'd moved in after the reforms and just enjoyed living in a well-managed community. Barbara Hutchins was scheduled for release after serving 10 years with good behavior. I saw a notice about it on a victim's notification system I'd signed up for. She'd be released to a halfway house in Tucson, required to continue making restitution payments from any income she earned, permanently barred from positions of financial trust. Part of me wondered what she'd do with the rest of her life. She'd be in her late 60s, a convicted felon, essentially unemployable for anything requiring trust or responsibility. Another part of me didn't care. She'd made choices, and choices had consequences. On a Tuesday evening, 7 years and 3 months after that fateful meeting, I was walking my dog through the neighborhood when I saw Marcus Webb standing outside one of the houses with a "for sale" sign. He waved. "Marcus? What are you doing here?" "Looking at houses," he said with a smile. "My wife and I are considering moving to Meadowbrook. We've heard it's the best-run HOA in Phoenix." I laughed. "Well, you'd know better than most why that is." "I'm serious," Marcus said. "I survey for a lot of HOAs, and most are disasters in one way or another, either too controlling or not controlling enough, or financially mismanaged. You guys found the balance. It's impressive. You started it," I pointed out. "If you hadn't done that research, found that buried survey, brought everything to light." "I just did my job," Marcus said. "You all did the hard work of rebuilding." We talked for a while longer. Marcus and his wife did end up buying the house, moving in 3 months later. He brought perspective and expertise to the community, serving on a new oversight committee we'd created to review financial practices annually. Life settled into a comfortable routine. Meadowbrook Estates became simply where I lived, not a source of constant drama. The HOA did what it was supposed to: maintain common areas, organized community events, facilitated communication between neighbors. It was boring in the best possible way. 10 years after that moment of silence when Marcus dropped his report, when Barbara Hutchins' world began to crumble, I was elected president of the HOA board. It felt full circle somehow. I'd started as an annoyed homeowner fighting over a garden gnome. Now I was leading the organization that had once made my life difficult. My first act as president was to commission a plaque for the community center, commemorating the reform and the people who'd made it possible. It read, "Meadowbrook Estates, a community built on transparency, accountability, and respect. Reform 2019-2020. Let this reminder keep us honest." We unveiled it at a community meeting, and several original board members attended: Tom Johnson, Helen Ortega, Peter Franklin. Diana Reed was there too, though she'd moved to a different neighborhood. Marcus Webb came with his wife. To the surveyor, who changed everything, I said, raising a glass of champagne we'd brought for the occasion. To the community that had the courage to change, Marcus countered. We all drank to that. Barbara Hutchins had tried to control Meadowbrook Estates, to bend it to her will and profit from it. Instead, she'd inadvertently freed us to create something better. Her downfall was our awakening. I sometimes wondered if she knew about our success, sitting in her halfway house in Tucson, probably working some minimum wage job and trying to rebuild a shattered life. Did she follow Meadowbrook news? Did she see the articles about our reforms, the conference presentations, the other HOAs using our toolkit? Did it matter to her that her greatest failure had become our greatest success? Probably not. People like Barbara, who'd convinced themselves they were the heroes of their own stories, rarely acknowledged their true impact. She'd probably tell anyone who'd listen that she'd been unfairly persecuted, that she'd tried her best, that ungrateful homeowners had destroyed her for minor mistakes. But we knew the truth. The documents didn't lie. The survey Marcus Webb had prepared, the buried report he'd discovered, the financial records that showed systematic theft, these told the real story. Barbara Hutchins had betrayed the people who trusted her, and she'd paid the price. Meadowbrook Estates, meanwhile, had become a model for what an HOA could be when it prioritized community over control. We'd turned our disaster into a blueprint for reform. That was something worth celebrating. As president, I made sure we never forgot. Every new board member got a thorough orientation, including the full history, the fraud, the investigation, the reforms. Every homeowner received a welcome packet explaining our accountability standards and why they existed. We stayed vigilant, because that was the lesson Marcus Webb had taught us when he dropped that report and exposed the truth. Vigilance mattered. Transparency mattered. Holding people accountable mattered. The moment you got complacent, the moment you stopped paying attention, that's when people like Barbara Hutchins could take control and cause damage. We'd learned that lesson the hard way, through theft and betrayal and a difficult recovery. But we'd learned it thoroughly. Meadowbrook Estates would never again be a place where one person could abuse their power unchecked. We'd built something better, something lasting. And it had all started with a surveyor, a buried report, and the courage to demand the truth. That was worth everything we'd been through. The money we'd lost, the stress we'd endured, the difficult work of rebuilding it was all worth it to create a community where people felt safe, respected, and heard, where HOA leadership was service, not tyranny, where neighbors were friends, not adversaries. Barbara Hutchins had wanted to be remembered as the president who maintained standards and property values. Instead, she'd be remembered as the criminal who stole from her neighbors and forced them to create something better. Sometimes the greatest changes come from the worst circumstances. I thought about all this standing in the community center, looking at the plaque we'd just unveiled, surrounded by people who'd fought alongside me to save our neighborhood. Marcus Webb was right, we'd found the balance, and we'd keep it through vigilance and transparency and genuine care for our community. That was the real story of Meadowbrook Estates, not the theft or the trial or the dramatic board meeting where everything exploded. Those were just chapters. The real story was what came after the hard, unglamorous work of building something good and maintaining it. The choice, made every day, to be better than what we'd been. That story continued. It would continue long after I stepped down as president, long after the current board members moved or retired. The systems we'd built, the culture we'd created, these would endure. Future residents would benefit from reforms they might not fully understand, living in comfort because people 7 years ago had refused to accept corruption and abuse. That was legacy. Not a name on a plaque or a position held, but a community transformed for the better. Marcus Webb's dropped report had started it, but we'd all finished it together, and we'd keep finishing it year after year, meeting after meeting, one small decision at a time. Meadowbrook Estates was more than just a neighborhood now. It was proof that communities could reform, that ordinary people could stand up to corruption, that transparency and accountability could create something worth protecting. We'd become an example, and that responsibility kept us honest. As the celebration wound down and people headed home, I stood outside the community center, watching neighbors talk and laugh. Kids chased each other around the playground. Someone was organizing a pickup basketball game. This was what we'd fought for, not perfection, but genuine community. Barbara Hutchins had nearly destroyed this. Marcus Webb had helped save it, and all of us together had rebuilt it into something stronger. That was the story. That was what mattered, and that was why, when I went to bed that night in my home in Meadowbrook Estates, garden gnomes still proudly displayed, I felt genuinely at peace. We'd taken the worst thing that could happen to an HOA and turned it into the best thing that could happen to a community. That was worth celebrating, that was worth remembering, and that was worth protecting for as long as any of us lived here. The surveyor had dropped his report. The room had gone silent, and in that silence, something new had been born, a community that refused to be victims, that chose instead to be survivors and reformers and examples. We'd earned our peace, we'd earned our pride, and we'd earned the right to tell our story, hoping other communities might learn from our hard-won wisdom. That was enough. That was everything. And as the years continued to pass, as Meadowbrook Estates kept thriving and growing and welcoming new residents into our reformed community, I knew that the sacrifice and struggle had been worth it. We'd created something lasting. We'd created something good. And it had all started with one surveyor brave enough to tell the truth, one dramatic moment when everything changed, and a community courageous enough to demand better. That was the story of Meadowbrook Estates, and I was proud to be part of it.